Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. Housing affordability is an incredibly contentious issue in many cities around the world. Where I live in Sydney, Australia, the median house price hit 1.6 million Australian dollars in January 2022, which was just a few months ago. And there have been a few tumbles. There is a bit of a concern about the housing market, but any minor price falls that we've had so far, which are very trivial, haven't really done much to increase housing affordability. If we look at home ownership rates in Australia, for the age demographic 25 to 34-year-olds, home ownership has actually decreased. In 1981, for the 25 to 34-year-old demographic, home ownership was 61%, and as of 2016, that has dropped to about 45%. And many of the reasons that home ownership has become so challenging for this demographic is that the price of houses has far outpaced the growth in wages. Now, if you're listening to this, you might fall into that demographic who is struggling to purchase their first home. Maybe you're in that age demographic. You could be older, you could be younger, but maybe you are concerned about housing affordability. Maybe you're a bit older and you have children and you're worried about how your children are going to be able to afford houses. Potentially you're an investor and you're happy with the system as it is because you've locked in great capital gains. And just from these three demographics, these three interest groups I've talked about, we can see why this is a contentious issue, because there are many parties who have different interests and they all want their best interests to be represented. And I think this is where we have a conflict in housing. Now, in this episode, I'm going to read through a blog post that I wrote 3 years ago. And in the second episode, I actually want to discuss what housing policies that I would implement if I was the benevolent ruler of Sydney, Australia, or maybe Australia in general. If I was in government, what would I do to address housing affordability and to make home ownership more accessible for the everyday Australian? Now, that said, these policies aren't inherently Australia specific. I'd like to think they're generic. That said, I'm going to save them for the second episode. Now, the following blog post that I'm about to read out was in response to some rather racist remarks made by a former New South Wales Labour Opposition Leader. And in his comments, as he was making some racist comments about Asians, he linked these comments back to housing affordability. So he used housing affordability as a mask for some racism, and I think this is where the housing affordability discussion becomes very ugly. So I'm going to read this, and hopefully it's going to highlight the real issues, not just with the housing market, but how politicians will manipulate these issues and push very, ulterior motives onto the ignorant and the uninformed. So here I go. The Australian dream is a dream because you truly need to be asleep to believe it. Which is exactly what the New South Wales Labour Opposition Leader, Mr. Michael Daley, seemed to be getting at this week in the media, much to his displeasure, releasing his comments regarding young people leaving Sydney and their jobs being taken over by Asians with PhDs.
There's a transformation happening in Sydney now where our kids are moving out and foreigners are moving in and taking their jobs. Our young children will flee, and who are they being replaced with? They're being replaced by young children, young people from typically Asia with PhDs. I don't want to sound xenophobic. It's not a xenophobic thing, it's an economic question.
Now, Mr. Daley may indeed be concerned about migration and its impacts on the housing market. Do the young of Sydney worry about their futures in a city where the median price of a detached home is hovering around $1 million? Absolutely. Does importing skilled migrants increase competition in the labour market for skilled jobs? Of course. Does population growth, due to migration or not, increase the burden on Sydney's infrastructure? Try taking a train during peak hour from the western suburbs to the city and back again. Are the demographics of Sydney changing? Undoubtedly. However, this wasn't Mr. Daley's primary reasoning for his comments, as he mentions in what I infer was a half-hearted attempt at an apology. Nor is this what I've chosen to nitpick in this debacle.
I have said that if anyone has taken offence to what I've said, I do apologise. Certainly no offence was intended. I want everyone's kids, they're all our kids, I want everyone's kids to be able to afford to live in Sydney, and it's housing affordability that's driving them out.
Mr. Daley is of the opinion that immigration is potentially the major contributing factor to the price of houses in Sydney, and just as well as all the aforementioned examples, this seems to be a simple case of supply and demand. As the demand for housing increases due to population growth, house prices must rise. Correct? Well, it's not that simple. When most people buy houses, especially in a city where the median household income is 1/10 of the median detached home price, very few potential buyers use their own money for more than 10 to 20% of the asking price. They have to borrow the difference from financial institutions. Imagine if buyers had no access to credit. House prices wouldn't be able to rise above what an individual is able to pay, being limited by their annual income and the length of time one has saved money for. However, when a buyer does have access to credit, this allows them to purchase a property at a price which they would not have previously been able to afford. When everyone has access to credit, the level of credit availability is what ultimately determines the significant portion of house prices. Hence, when it comes to the case of Sydney house prices and many other cities in Australia and around the world, the ultimate reason for a housing bubble is that credit has been too cheap for too long. Whilst migration is used as a tool by our politicians to keep consumption in the economy propped up and to ensure that there are more players to take out larger mortgages at the bottom of our housing Ponzi scheme, it is not the sole or even the major contributing factor to our current housing affordability crisis. Evidence for this can be seen in the aftermath of the Banking Royal Commission, which has resulted in tighter lending standards. Surprise, surprise, when credit dries up and potential homeowners' ability to pay higher prices drops, the price of housing in our capital cities is beginning to fall. Whilst I'm in favour of temporarily reducing migration, and I say this as a migrant myself, to cities such as Sydney in order to allow our infrastructure and labour markets to catch up, unfortunately for Mr. Daley, I'm not naive enough to take his rhetoric at face value. As young people, it's easy to be misled and take Mr. Daley's way out and scapegoat an entire ethnic group or immigration in general as the cause for Sydney's exorbitant house prices. However, I implore you to look deeper. For too long, politicians from both sides of the political divide have relied on our ignorance to guide us away from the root cause of this issue. It's simply because it's unpopular and, more importantly, incredibly unprofitable to have a sustainable residential property market. Ideally, if you aspire to own a home that is without becoming an indentured servant of the Big Four banks, you should be marching in the streets for A, tighter lending standards, and B, higher interest rates for residential property. Even more draconian, perhaps, a government-mandated income to maximum residential mortgage value ratio. We need to ask ourselves, do we really want to turn our homes into an investment class moving forward? Perhaps it is just easier to blame the Asians. Now, having read through that blog post from 2019, it's incredible to see how things have changed and how wrong I was about certain things. I think the first thing I'd like to point out is when I wrote that, back in 2019, the median Sydney house price was 1 million Australian dollars, and in 3 years, it's risen $600,000 to 1.6. So in 3 years, I mean, that's an incredible rate of growth. In just 3 years, to have the median house price jump up by $600,000, that's more than half. I think the second area where I was incredibly wrong was when I talked about the Banking Royal Commission. Now, it would have been, I think, it was very, at the time, I think, I was very naive to think that a Banking Royal Commission would result in tighter lending standards. And if anything, we probably saw lending standards relaxed again, especially with the advent of COVID and further drops in interest rates. I think more money was pumped into the markets, and this unfortunately resulted in higher housing prices. That being said, I think there are very important points raised in that blog post. And it's very interesting to see how politicians can really hijack issues such as housing affordability and push racist agendas such as Mr. Daley did back in 2019, amongst other things. So I think politicians really do prey on our misinformation so they can keep taking advantage of us. Now, that being said, I'm very keen to talk about policy implementations and do a bit of a deep dive into what policies that I would implement to address housing affordability. So that's what I'll leave you with for today. And if you yourself have any comments on the housing market and housing affordability, be it in Sydney, Australia, or in whatever city of the world you live in, you can message me at hassie@monologuesbyhassie.com. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favourite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.